There are some Jewish jokes that are as old as the hills, but are worth retelling. The story goes that there is a man who is trying to get into the synagogue on Yom Kippur, and it is packed. And this is one of those synagogues where everyone needs a ticket to get in. Every seat is full. He's like, I just need to tell my brother something. And the usher says, look, no one's getting in there. It is full. If you don't have a ticket, you can't come in. He's pleading with him. And finally, the usher is moved and said, okay, fine, you can go in, but don't let me catch you praying. I had a similar experience a number of years ago, about 5 years ago, when I was visiting the land of Israel. And it was a very unusual trip in that I spent almost all of it in the West Bank. I spent some of my time in Palestinian towns and villages, and I spent some of them with Jews in their habitations, in their cities, in their towns. And the group that I was with, there was actually a night that I spent sleeping over in a village outside of Bethlehem. And it's a really unique experience when someone hands you a cell phone and says, okay, if you get into trouble, dial 911 on this phone, and the PLO is who's going to come and rescue you. And the only advice that they gave was, if you're going to pray in the morning, if you're going to put on talis and tefillin, don't do it by a window. Make sure you do it in a closed room that, you don't need to show off that you're there. Your host family is happy to have you, and in fact, it was lovely. Had very strong coffee and sat on the patio, and we talked, and we got to know each other. And so I actually did get to pray that morning, and I had the, Jews, wherever they are, when we pray, we face towards Jerusalem. And so I had the unique experience here. We face east towards Jerusalem. There, I actually got to face north because I was in a village that was south of Jerusalem. So that was actually not the place where I didn't get to pray. The place where I was told, but don't let me catch you praying, was actually in some ways the last place you would expect, because it is the place that is holiest in all of Jerusalem, in all of the world to Jews, the Temple Mount. So if you've ever been to Israel, recently the way it works is if you are not a Muslim and you want to get to the top of the Temple Mount, there are a couple of hours, 1 or 2 hours a day that are open, although interestingly, the group, the Waqf that controls the Temple Mount does not recognize daylight savings time, so the hours that are posted don't match what's on your watch. So I stood in line, and most of the tourists who were there were able to ascend freely and walk around on the platform on top of the mountain where the Jewish temple once stood, and where now there are two very important Muslim sites, the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So most of the other guests were able to wander freely, but apparently I was selected as someone who was a high prayer risk. The Israeli police knew just by looking at me that I was likely to break out into liturgy at any moment. And I was warned, at the first sign of supplication, at the first hint of a hosanna, that was going to be it for me. And so we were in this special group, and we were given 10 minutes to walk on a particular route, and then we were brought down. And so of all the places in the world, right, where one is not allowed to pray, that was it. And as a little bit of background, our Torah portion this week describes the ancient tabernacle, which accompanied our ancestors through the desert, and talks about the rituals to cleanse it and to atone for the sins of the people. And Aaron is reminded that two of his sons actually perished for going in the wrong way. And by the way, that tabernacle was a template for the temple that stood in Jerusalem. And so, in fact, when the temple stood, it was one of the holiest places it was the holiest place in all of Judaism. And anyone who wanted to could undergo a ritual of cleansing, could immerse, and then could come up onto the Temple Mount. Anyone in the world who wanted to. Jewish, not Jewish, whoever you were, you could ascend. If you were actually bringing an offering, you could go a step further. There were certain areas that were off limits, only the priests could enter. And then there was the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest could go, only on Yom Kippur. And that spot is where the Dome of the Rock stands today. In the year 70, that's 1952 years ago, for those of you keeping count, the temple was destroyed. And for most of the time of our exile from the land of Israel, we were not allowed to ascend the mountain at all. First, there was a Roman temple there, and then later, the Muslim shrines, the Dome of the Rock, was constructed on the site. And the way that the Western Wall became the holiest site in Jerusalem, in Israel, for our Jewish people, was because that's as close as you could get. So you've ever seen pictures of the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall. Why that spot? Because you weren't allowed to go up to the holy place. That was as far up as you could get. In 1948, that was all supposed to change. So 74 years ago this week, as we observe Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel's Independence Day, there was the foundation of the State of Israel. And the plan was that Jerusalem was going to be an international city, open to everyone, belonging to the world. Anyone could come and worship and be inspired. Jews, Christians, Muslims, whoever could all come together. But that's not the way it worked out. There was a war, and when the dust settled, not only the Temple Mount, but even the Western Wall was off limits to Jews. For 19 years, from 1948 to 1967, the closest you could get was West Jerusalem, and even then you wanted to keep your head down because there were snipers. In 1967, in the Six-Day War, Israeli troops liberated the old city, and yet again, Jews could come and pray at the Western Wall. And the question was raised, what to do about the Temple Mount? What to do about the Muslim holy sites on top of this mountain? And the Israeli government made a controversial decision to say, we are going to leave it under the control of the Waqf, of Muslim religious authorities affiliated with Jordan, and we are going to not assume sovereignty. Which is a remarkable thing, because normally when you conduct a war, when you win a war, to the victor go the spoils. And Israel said, no, we are hands off. And so to this day, by the way, in a Jerusalem that, in a world that is completely open, in the Middle East that is increasingly open, you can find kosher restaurants in Dubai, right? You can go to synagogues in Morocco. But there is still one spot where Jewish prayer is prohibited, and it is the one spot that is actually supposed to be the most holy place for Jews to pray. In the last decades, the Temple Mount has increasingly been a flashpoint. So as Israeli right-wingers will assert, look, this is our holiest spot, we have the right to go up there. And what has happened in the last few weeks is that there are Islamic organizations, terrorist organizations, that have urged young Palestinians to gather in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, armed with rocks and fireworks, to riot against local authorities and throw them down on the Jewish worshipers at the Western Wall below. And so actually desecrating their own holy place, they were daring Israeli police to respond while meanwhile thousands of peaceful Muslim worshipers were trying to come to recite prayers because, by the way, this past month for Jews has been Nisan, the month of Passover, and for Muslims has been Ramadan, a holy month of fasting and prayer. And so the organizations, Hamas and other organizations, knew how this were going to play out. There were mass terrorists up there throwing incendiary devices and rocks. Israeli police respond. And so what do you know? There are TV reports of Israeli police in a mosque while people are throwing things. And meanwhile, my friends in Israel reported that on Passover, normally the middle days of Passover are when many Jews come to the Western Wall to pray. And the Western Wall was almost abandoned on the first day because people knew that there were incendiary devices and rocks stored several hundred feet up. Now, by the way, this is an annual event. So last year during Ramadan, the same thing happened in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And as the conflict grew, it turned into the war with Gaza that we all, many of us, saw. And maybe we can breathe a sigh of relief this year because we are celebrating Rosh Chodesh tomorrow, and Muslims are celebrating the end of Ramadan and Eid al-Fitr, which is the festival which ends, the observance which ends Ramadan, and the tensions will drop, and maybe we'll go back to the way things were until next year. But it's not quite done because the waves spread out. So there are protests around the world. So there was a rally in Chicago where the organizer, they proclaimed, Israel, stop attacking our holy sites. And nothing could be further from the truth because every day tens of thousands of Muslims are going up there and their prayer is being disrupted by people who are trying to use it as a site from which to throw rocks and grenades. But the battle has spread out. So, for example, I am contractually obligated once a month to mention that I went to Harvard. And so this week, the Harvard Crimson actually came out with an editorial endorsing the BDS movement, saying that Israel should be boycotted, that Harvard should divest, that there should be sanctions. And I thank you for coming along on this journey for me, a little bit of a trip through history, because I want to point out, if one thing is clear from this muddled East, it is the absurdity of saying that Judaism's holiest site is the one place where Jews are not allowed to visit, certainly not pray. As we read the story this morning of the tabernacle, right, and to think about what the tabernacle and the temple in Jerusalem meant to us as a people, right? The fact is that Israel, as a country, violates the civil liberties of its Jewish citizens in order to ensure that Muslims are not offended by things that Jews do. Now, by the way, not to say that Israel is perfect. Israel also has things to apologize for. I don't deny that. But I want to point out that there is no other place in the world, right? If you have accusations of apartheid or anything else, the fact that at their holiest site Jews are discriminated against should give a lie to that accusation to begin with. And so the challenges of conflicts between Jews and Palestinians date back generations. And while I hope for a resolution, my friends, both in the peace camp and in the camp of no, we can definitely beat them, all agree that this is not an issue that is going to be resolved quickly or easily. But I think that this is something that we need to be attuned to, that we need to be aware of. And I know that there are some here for whom this issue is personal because we are of the Jewish faith, and so this is something that matters to us. And there are some of us for whom this is not our fight. We have no dog in this fight, right? We don't pray in a synagogue or a mosque. And so this dispute really just seems irrelevant to us. But I just want to point out that, in fact, this is a conflict in one of the holiest places of the world, and that what you read in the papers, what you see in the media, may not really be reflective of the whole truth. And so, as we think about how this issue might be resolved, I encourage us to be aware, to be active, to not rely on just one source of information. And when someone asks you what you can do about it, well, don't let me catch you praying. Shabbat shalom.